Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to lead off the conference today, day two, implementing the three pillars of environmental democracy. My name is Devin O'Shaughnessy, and I'm happy to lead this event to kick things off. It was great to see such high levels of participation from a broad and diverse set of speakers and participants yesterday during day one of the conference. All the sessions were very interesting and made different but equally compelling points on why environmental democracy is so important. This conference was first dreamed up about a year ago, and to see it to come to fruition this week has been very inspiring because it demonstrates that even with the terrible events in Ukraine at the moment, and many of our colleagues and friends having to drop what they were doing to respond to the crisis, that so many people have been able to participate. Over the last decade or so, we've seen the twin crises of democratic backsliding and environmental degradation emerge as possibly the greatest threats to the future of our planet and to humanity. And though these crises have many different contributing factors, drivers, and repercussions, at their heart, I believe more than anything, they are failures of governance and a failure of politics. A failure of governments to tackle the hardest issues, and an ability to deliver for their people, and an inability to deliver for their people. A failure of information, and in some cases, in terms of the hard, verifiable data, and in others, insufficient understanding among citizens and their elected officials of the problems they are facing and the likely solutions. A failure to include citizens in decision-making on the issues that really matter, and therefore a tendency for policymaking to be captured by, unfortunately, often malign special interests, and a failure to ensure equal treatment and the rule of law, where all citizens have the same rights, including the right to live healthy, fulfilling lives and not be harmed by government action or inaction. Environmental democracy holds the potential to address all of these shortcomings. And in today's session, we'll go into depth on the three pillars of environmental democracy: access to information, citizen participation, and access to justice. But before we move into those sessions, I want to take a moment to talk about what traditional democracy assistance organizations like WWFD and NDI can contribute to environmental democracy. Over and over, when taking part in discussions on why the 700 plus international environmental declarations, conventions, and treaties fail to deliver results, the missing ingredient always seems to come down to a lack of political will. And while Professor Evan Lieberman yesterday said we should do away with the term, I think it's fine to use, but I couldn't agree more that we need to talk about what drives political will: incentives, disincentives, and motivations. In all these conversations about political will, rarely does one hear convincing answers as to how to create this political will, particularly in the sustained manner necessary to solve problems that will likely take many decades to successfully address. The dominant theory of change still seems to center around agreeing to ever more ambitious international agreements, followed up by more climate funding, technological know-how, private sector investment, and civic activism. And while each of these is undoubtedly important and critical to achieving what we're trying to achieve, history repeatedly demonstrates that this has not been enough. We cannot sit back and hope that the international pledges made today and at COP26 will mean that by 2050, we have reached net zero, much less stalled the biodiversity and desertification crises, reversed deforestation, cleaned our oceans, or prevented a spiraling number of natural disasters. So what to do? How do we create the necessary political will to act? To me, we need to understand, engage with, and then change politics. Tackling climate change and other forms of serious environmental degradation will mean adopting a wide range of sweeping reforms to our economies, our infrastructure, our behavior, and our day-to-day lives. It will also mean significant political and institutional change. New environmental policies, if implemented, will create winners and losers, some of whom are extremely wealthy, powerful, and politically connected, if not active in politics themselves. Weak and opaque campaign finance regulations create multiple opportunities for those opposed to change to undermine real reform, even when they are saying the right things in public. Environmental activism requires sufficient political space, freedoms, for example, of association and speech, and access to decision makers for environmental NGOs and activists. But in many countries, politicians are already closing civic space in efforts to safeguard their own power and interests. Parliaments and the justice system have critical roles to play in identifying problems, demanding accountability, and safeguarding citizens from environmental harm, but consistently take a back seat to the executive branch, and frankly, too often let them off the hook. And while there are new mechanisms for citizens to participate in policymaking through citizens' assemblies and juries and direct online engagement, early successes with climate assemblies have not demonstrated their full potential to create change. These are issues of great familiarity to the democracy assistance sector, using political economy analysis, thinking and working politically approaches, but rarely have these organizations turned their attention to addressing climate and the environment. However, this is starting to change. A number of organizations participating in this conference, including the co-sponsors, Westminster Foundation for Democracy and the National Democratic Institute, but also UNDP, International IDEA, European Partnership for Democracy, and many others, as well as the governments and donors that support them, have already started to take some important steps. In my view, these democracy assistance organizations have particular value to bring in working with politicians, parliaments, political parties, and movements, which I consider the engines of political will. Where many other NGOs or multilateral institutions fear to tread, democracy assistance organizations have decades of experience working with politicians and have an innate sense of what makes them tick, what influences and motivates them, and how to support them to improve democratic governance. Democracy organizations understand the often arcane and confusing rules, procedures, and practices of legislatures, and how politics, electoral systems, and institutional capacity can influence what does and does not happen inside parliaments and other elected bodies. Finally, democracy assistance organizations are one of the very few actors comfortable working with perhaps the most underappreciated engine of environmental political will, political parties. When political parties make decisions about what to campaign on, what to include in their manifestos, and on what to focus their political scrutiny, these decisions directly translate into what governments do, what laws are passed, and what is at the center of public debate. We've seen political parties across the globe have increasing success when they campaign on green issues, particularly as the climate crisis has worsened. But these can be very sensitive issues to campaign on and are not guaranteed vote winners. Therefore, parties need support to better understand environmental issues and identify what policies can be political and electoral winners. Once they become more fluent on the environment, they'll be more likely to put green issues front and center in their political and governance agendas. But it will not be enough to bring in traditional democracy assistance actors to focus more on the environment. They need to find a place amongst the environmental organizations that have led this work for the last half-decade plus and complement the technical knowledge, experience, and specialization that groups like World Resources Institute, UNEP, International Institute for Environment and Development, WWF, and Greenpeace already have. They need to work together with organizations like Client Earth to supercharge the access to justice pillar of environmental democracy, which I personally think could be the most powerful weapon in forcing governments to act, even more than parliamentary scrutiny or media campaigns. And all actors across the board need to work together to put political inclusion and the leadership of Indigenous groups, women, young people, and those living in poverty, all groups that have faced and continue to face the worst impact of climate change and environmental degradation, despite having little responsibility for causing it, at the heart of their efforts. This conference is only one step on the way to what I hope will be a sustained and fruitful partnership between the democracy assistance and environmental sectors. But the initial promise that has already been revealed in the planning of this conference and during day one leave me very optimistic for the future. Today, we have an absolutely all-star cast of speakers from too many great organizations to list all at once. But I particularly want to thank our chairs of the three sessions, WFD Governor Thomas Hughes, Alicia Todd, Director General of Parlaméricas, and Yamid Dagnier, Director, Climate Justice at Open Society Foundations. And with that, I'll happily hand off to Thomas Hughes to present the next session on the first pillar of environmental democracy, access to information, trends, and challenges.
Devin, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this panel on the trends and challenges regarding access to information and environmental democracy. As Devin outlined, access to information is one of the three pillars of environmental democracy being addressed by this conference today. And the following panels during the course of the afternoon are going to be exploring participation and also access to justice. For attendees, I would also strongly encourage you to participate in those two panels as well. On this particular panel, we'll be discussing the issues of corruption and transparency and the implication this has for access to information. And as Devin outlined, we have four excellent panelists joining us today who will be digging into these various issues. So firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce Rosario Pavesi, who is Open Government Partnership Senior Regional Coordinator for the Americas and is a political scientist and open government activist. For the past 13 years, Rosario has worked on democracy strengthening and development, particularly focusing on the open government agenda. Since 2017, Rosario has provided guidance and assistance to civil society organizations and governments across South America, supporting the development and implementation of open government reforms. And prior to joining OGP, Rosario worked for the Buenos Aires government, city government, as well as the Argentine chapter of Transparency International, and has also taught various courses and continues to teach courses at the University San Isidro. Bryce Bomer is our next panelist. He is the Climate and Environment Lead for Transparency International. Bryce leads TI's efforts on climate and environmental issues, providing strategic direction and leadership for TI's work on climate, land, and water governance. Bryce joined TI in 2012 after 7 years spent working as a consultant on sustainable development for the European Commission, environmental ministries, and the private sector. His role as the global lead on environmental and climate issues includes overseeing governance programs on transparency and accountability, and also integrity. Bryce is also representing TI in different institutions, including the Water Integrity Network, as well as being an observer for the UNFCCC, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. Our next panelist is Dr. Mark Robinson, who is the Executive Director of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The EITI brings together governments and companies and civil society organizations to promote governance reforms in oil, gas, and mining. And Mark has over 30 years experience in governance and extractives and climate and international development, and a career spanning the worlds of policy, operations, research, and philanthropy. Prior to joining EITI in November 2018, Mark served as Global Director for Governance at the World Resources Institute, and previously held senior positions at DFID and the Institute for Development Studies, Ford Foundation, and the Overseas Development Institute. And finally, we have with us Dr. Aled Williams, who is the Senior Advisor at the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center. Aled coordinates work on corruption and anti-corruption efforts in natural resources and the energy sectors, and is also co-editor of books including Corruption, Natural Resources and Development, as well as Grabbing and Development. Aled's PhD, which is from SOAS, combined political ethnography in central Sulawesi with satellite and survey data to produce a political ecology of efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, as well as forest conservation and sustainable management of forests in Sulawesi in Indonesia. Aled was also previously research coordinator for USAID's Targeting Natural Resources Corruption Project, and was in the Policy and Research Department at Transparency International as well. We are encouraging all the attendees, as well as the panelists, to live tweet about the conference. Do please use the Our Planet Needs Democracy hashtag and take part in the conversation on social media. Please feel free also to engage on social media on the other sessions, and you can find the full agenda on WFD's Conference Environmental Democracy website. During the course of the panel, you can also submit written questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. And finally, before we turn to our panelists, do please be aware that the session is being recorded and will be available as well on WFD's website in the following week. So let me turn to our panelists. And what I will do is start by asking each of them in turn a few questions to open up the conversation. And then towards the end of our hour, turn to you, the attendees, to see whether you have questions for them as well. So with that, Rosario, let me start with you. So what do you think of the synergies between OGP and the Escazú Agreement? And how is OGP making a difference?
I don't know.
Well, first,
spreadsheet.
thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here discussing and learning with you. Let me start by giving you a brief introduction to OGP and Escazú so we can fully understand the links and synergies. The Open Government Partnership is an international platform that allows governments and civil society organizations in 77 countries and 76 local jurisdictions to co-create reforms to address the most urgent public problems that we face, including corruption, public service delivery, access to justice, fiscal transparency, among so many other issues. Fortunately, the open government community is actively using OGP to address some of the most challenging issues around environment and climate change. There are many OGP commitments focused on environment, which are, of course, previous to the Escazú Agreement. In the recent years, we have seen a notable increase in commitments that address climate change, transparency on extractive industries. EITI, for example, who is present here, is a key partner that is part of various action plans in the region. And the release, for example, of open data sets that provide information on key environmental industries like forestry and fisheries. These commitments have particularly gained traction in the Americas and Europe over the last years. For example, as part of their 2017 action plan, Germany committed to increasing citizen participation in environmental policies, while Canada committed to expanded access to environment and climate research data. So what happens with the Escazú Agreement? Well, the Escazú Agreement presents an historical opportunity for us in the region. As you may know, it guarantees the right of access to environmental information, public participation in the decision-making processes, and also access to justice in environmental matters. But more importantly, it provides measures and mechanisms to exercise and enforce these rights. It is also the only binding agreement emanating from the United Nations Sustainable Development Conference. It's our first regional environmental agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the first in the world to contain specific provisions to protect human rights activists. It entered into force last year after 12 Latin American countries ratified it. And for us, as we see, the synergies are very clear. OGP is an excellent, well-established platform that can be used to implement the principles and obligations in the Escazú Agreement, because mainly we share the same values of transparency, accountability, and participation. And we also provide a structure to create reforms with input from civil society, academia, private sector, and of course, governments, clear timelines for these co-creation processes, and an independent assessment.
Rosario, thank you. So thinking back to when the Escazú Agreement was ratified, I think there were very high expectations. So what are now the main challenges for implementation that you see at the moment? What are the obstacles? And what is the role for the international community? How can it help?
Well, as you know, the Escazú Agreement is so broad and encompassing that full compliance will require that governments develop new legislation, public policies, programs, and systems. It would also require, which is very challenging, some changes in practices and attitude, as the decision-making process will have to become more inclusive, and governments will have to give up power in order for citizens to participate in these processes. Importantly, this will affect the entrenched economic interest of corrupt public and private actors. As you may have heard, Latin America is the most dangerous region in the world to be an environmental activist, according to Global Witness latest reports. So the situation is not easy. And all of this happens in a context where fake news and misinformation make a significant part of the population question things like global warming, for example. But there are glimmers of hope. We're optimistic too. We are seeing various countries already using OGP to advance and consolidate the Escazú Agreement. For example, Ecuador pioneered Escazú commitments by carrying out participative process to identify all the laws, rules, regulations that will have to change in order to fully comply the agreement. This process included working with civil society, academia, and local movements to create a governance mechanism and build proposals and a roadmap in a collaborative way. In Panama, for example, the Ministry of Environment, civil society, and academia are working to create an environmental information system through a participatory process to start to address the access to information components of Escazú. In the case of Uruguay, for example, in their latest action plan, they have just presented it, they included 4 commitments focused on management, surveillance, and environmental protection, and also territorial planning aimed at fulfilling the Escazú Agreement. So we are seeing these early efforts. Of course, there's much to do still. The international community support over the next year will be a crucial element if we are to succeed in these challenges. In OGP, we are already in close collaboration with multilateral organizations such as the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the Development Bank of Latin America, the Inter-American Development Bank, but also with other international initiatives and civil society organizations like EITI, TI, NRGI, the World Resources Institute, and of course, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, just to mention some. The challenge is huge, but also is the historic opportunity we have to take action. Countries have committed to a very ambitious initiative, and we, as an open government platform, can offer a space not only to hold them accountable, but also to open spaces for inclusion and public participation.
Rosario, thank you. And unfortunately, on this panel, we'll have the opportunity to hear from some of those organizations. Bryce, if I can turn to you next, building on Rosario's comments, what do you think are the key trends currently in access to information and the ongoing challenges in terms of implementing access to information agreements?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. And yeah, firstly, I would like to say that the way we see it is that access to information and transparency is a mean to an end. No, it's a key building block for also the focus of the next sessions and about participation and justice. So it's when we talk also about access to information and disinformation, it shouldn't be only about data, but also about accountability of which decisions have been made. And as such, it can be a very powerful tool against corruption. And at TI, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power, for private gain. So we can see that corruption can manifest in different forms. What we're sure of and what we see more and more, unfortunately, is that it enables environmental destructions and weakens democracy. So research makes clear links between having a healthy democracy and successfully fighting public sector corruption, and issues of environment and climate change are also very related to those. And when it comes to one specific aspect of the environmental information, the climate, talking about climate information, there is currently still a big lack of relevant and decision useful climate information, and very strong limitations when we look at the quality, comparability, consistency, and so on. That's why it's still very important to target prioritizing that, and also talking about those linkages as we do during those days between environment and governance issues. I think there are some positive steps or positive trends, as you said. So we just heard about Escazú agreement. There is also the Aarhus Convention that we heard from yesterday. There is also the revised African Convention on the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. There is also the Tromsø Convention that we heard a bit less about, but that is not limited to environmental information, but it is about general right to information, and also, even if it's regional, it is open for worldwide ratification. But of course, as we know, there is a slow uptake of those conventions. There is limited ratification. However, I wanted to add one more point about the Aarhus Convention, because I think this is a very interesting practice, is that it has embedded a compliance mechanism in the form of a committee. So I think that's very good, and we should of course encourage more countries to sign and ratify those agreements, and also the national information laws, right? I think more than 120 countries have one now. However, there are also some worrying trends that we saw also in the past couple of years because of COVID, or linked to COVID, or COVID being used as an excuse to attack those right to information. So as there are, these emergencies are often used as a pretext, but not a real reason. No? So we've seen, for example, attempts in Brazil to suspend deadlines for compliance with the access to information bills. We've seen restrictive laws in Mexico. Even if Mexico is adopted the Escazú agreement, they started creating executive orders that put at risk access to information about the environment, and would use the argument of some strategic infrastructure projects, for example, refinery, airports, etc., to be done without the approval of the permits by environmental authorities. So that's something that we are worried about. And even if we look at international organizations, and some that have even a good track record, those have difficulties upholding the standards. So we saw a case, for example, from the Green Climate Fund, that instead of 30 days, the person had to wait for more than 1 year to receive a response to a request for information. So here we see that we need more focus and maybe more means and more support, and also financial support for the implementation of those.
Bryce, thank you. When you started answering that question, you talked about the link between transparency and accountability and access to information. Can you speak to us a little bit about how environmental information is a key to also enabling access to justice?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's, as I said, it's access to information is kind of the first step, towards participation, accountability, and justice. My colleagues in Brazil, for example, worked with an indigenous rights organization on the lack of transparency related to environmental licensing of infrastructure projects in a state, Mato Grosso. And there it showed that the response to freedom of information request required a year in average. But these projects have an impact on the lives and territories of the indigenous people. So those failures have a direct impact and affect the environmental justice and the rights of those communities, including the right of pre-prior informed consent. So the FPIC haven't been respected most of the time, including in climate projects, I would say. And of course, another aspect is the access to remedies when something goes wrong, the access to grievance mechanisms. And here, if we turn to an example from the Maldives, for example, as a country that is receiving large amounts for climate adaptation and mitigation, there is still no proper mechanism to monitor how these funds are being used. There is no database containing project information, for example, so that civil society, community-based organization, and also the public can track how the implementation of those projects are going, how those funds are being used. That means that the public or those groups are unable to scrutinize as well the decisions made, because they are unable to access the information. And we've seen that in one case where on an island there was a vegetation removal case, where people could actually, following public scrutiny, kind of keep the government accountable. So CSOs, civil society, put pressure on government and on the Environmental Protection Agency so that a case is open, and after investigation, the EPA realized that some of these acts were against the regulation environment, and actions were taken and fine was imposed. So we can see that those compliance mechanism and also the fact that it's accessible are of the essence. But the problem is that often, and in that case also, the Environmental Protection Agency itself is not fully independent. And that means that those bodies are not able to fully play their role in terms of monitoring and oversight and holding environmental offenders accountable. So that's another aspect that is not only about law enforcement, but really guaranteeing the independence of those bodies. And lastly, what I wanted to mention is that we run ourselves some compliance mechanism, so offering victims of corruption a way to try redress. And we realized that most of the complaints that we receive are related to land. And even if there are a multiplication of information sources related to land, only 1% of land ownership data is really accessible. That means that those registration systems can be captured by the hands of powerful elites, it's very difficult to have access to information about the processes and criteria that has been used when there are some competing rights that exist in several countries. So in Cameroon, we managed to digitalize some of the land registry to avoid manipulation of those documents, even if we are conscious that this also represents risks, because we need to be aware of which groups have access to communication tools.
Bryce, thank you. You've talked to us a little bit about how manipulation and delays are used to obstruct access to information. Of course, another avenue might be the type of information and the way in which that information is actually released. So can you speak to us a little bit also about the challenges related to the access to quality information?
Yeah, of course, the quality of the information is key. I mean, what we notice is there is still, I would say, I mean, there are of course some technical challenges, is the one I just referred to, but there is also still a culture of secrecy, I would say, and where conflict of interest and levels of corruption are also challenging the access and the quality of the information that is available. So when it comes to government bodies, it makes the decisions that they make very difficult to assess if they are in line with existing climate change policies, for example, or if they are politically motivated, and if some leaders have been making those decisions because they can benefit from it. And since most of the public are not aware of the information related to these decisions or projects, for example, it's very difficult to assess how these decisions have been made. And also, we've been seeing cases where, due to political pressure, information officers, for example, haven't been giving out the whole information that is supposed to be given. And this can be because of corruption, this can be because of conflict of interest or undue influence. And what we saw doing research in Bangladesh with our colleagues there, for example, is that Again, there was very little information when it comes to climate investments and project names. What does it entail? What kind of activities and so on? Those were not disclosed. So it means that the vulnerable people and the local population were very rarely consulted before the planning and the approving of the projects. And it led to result about 35% of the climate funds that we looked at being lost because of corruption. So this is very key here. Very key is being conscious about those corruption risks and addressing them and regulating those this undue influence and those conflict of interest. So this culture on the public side is unfortunately also reflected in the private actors. So we can see more and almost more and more, and you know, the conflict with Ukraine show it again, private secrecy. And here, if we look at a case from Brazil, we saw after research that there was a gold refinery being approved, but being related to a family that was famous for gold smuggling and laundering in Africa, in DRC. And those actors had been already sanctioned. But because of the use of different infrastructure to avoid and evade taxes, through the use of, you know, bankers, accountants, and so on, and it made it very difficult to see which ones are the real owners of those new investments. So this is why we are calling for free public access to the real beneficial owners and through public registries. And of course, again, here, as you said, I mean, the quality of the data is also important, and the format of the data is also important, so that it can be, for example, machine readable. And the last point I wanted to make is about the restricted civic space. As I was saying in the first question about some of the implications of COVID. I mean, we've seen also some civil society organizations and some environmental activists and defenders, as well as we just heard, being labeled as troublemakers, you know. And of course, as we know, this leads also to detention, to jail, to torture, and to killings. So here, one aspect that we think is very important to overcome that barrier is protecting whistleblowers, protecting environmental defenders, and enabling this environment for civil society to be strong and to be able to monitor and not only access the information.
Bryce, thank you very much. Mark, if we can turn to you now. EITI arguably works in probably one of the most central to this set of issues, but also maybe one of the most challenging sectors in terms of the extractive sector. So can you speak to us about how EITI is fostering public debate on data and information openness?
Thank you, Thomas, and many thanks for having me join you at this event. Greetings from Oslo. I really welcome this focus on environmental democracy. I think it's the first of any such event that has ever taken place. I'm pleased because in my old job at WRI, this was a big focus of our work, and you're going to hear some of that from Yamid, I think, later. And I believe for a long time, these issues have been siloed for far too long. So terrific that WFD and NDI are taking this initiative. A few quick pointers on what we do. Nearly 20 years old, we were set up by the UK as an international initiative to advance good governance and transparency in oil, gas, and mining. The FCDO, and prior to that, the DFID were instrumental in supporting us since that time, but we are now Oslo-based and have been since 2007. And those who want to learn more about the EITI, we actually launched our fabulous new website today, so do take a look to read all about us. Our current strategic priorities focus on anti-corruption, energy transition, and domestic resource mobilization. And open data is fundamental to how we operate. An increased impact emphasis and on ESG as well. And with a growing focus too on gender and environmental reporting. I'll say a little bit more about that. Of the 56 EITI countries, half are now in Africa, and as mentioned at the introduction, we have a multi-stakeholder structure at scale, both at the international board, but in each of the 56 countries, bringing together companies, governments, and civil society around the table to monitor progress on EITI implementation. We're also fortunate to have 65 leading companies in oil, gas, and mining engaged in our board and supporting our work with hundreds of NGOs around the world. We have a standard which sets the framework for reporting progress on Extractive's disclosure for the 56 countries, all the way from production to revenues. So it's a fairly well-established system. So very specifically, I think you're interested to hear a bit more about what is it that we do to foster public debate on openness and access to information. Back in 2003, we issued a set of principles that still govern the way we work. And just to quote principle number 4, and it stated, we recognize that a public understanding of government revenues and expenditure over time can help public debate and informed choice of appropriate and realistic options for sustainable development. So from the outset, we've been all about fostering public debate, improving public understanding by putting out information on revenues in the sector into the public domain. And this was a first for many countries in our early years, getting the reports out, getting the data and information out about taxes and royalties and fees paid by companies, and then checking that against what governments said they received. Ever since then, we've been disaggregating by project, by company, by revenue stream. So it's a very disaggregated set of data, sometimes very complicated. So some of the challenges, how to communicate that in simple and accessible ways for a whole range of different stakeholders. So we have huge interest ongoing in the work from media, civil society, and national stakeholders, in turn generating pressure for accountability. We may be in a transparency initiative. Ultimately, we are seeking improved accountability on the part of decision makers in governments and companies. Now, a couple of words on environmental democracy. That's not what we primarily work on. We are primarily working on the governance of natural resources, but of course, participation, transparency, and respect for civic space are all foundational principles that govern how we work. And of course, the extractive industries have major environmental implications that are well known to the audience. Our growing focus on the energy transition and on the sourcing of critical minerals will certainly deepen that focus. And of course, mining, gas, and oil operations all have very significant environmental impacts. And in the latest version of the EITI reporting standard, we've now got a clear provision around environmental reporting. And that provision encourages implementing countries to disclose information on the management and monitoring of the environmental impact of extractive activities. So stakeholders can agree priorities for disclosure, in turn coming out of national priorities for the sector, and increased demands for transparency at national and local levels. Excuse me. And we believe that by including environmental disclosures in the EITI reporting, stakeholders can much better understand the regulatory framework and how it is implemented in practice.
Mark, thank you. So on that question of reporting, how is data and information put into the public domain with your different constituencies?
So the multi-stakeholder groups in each of the countries bring together our 3 constituencies are integral to that. They supervise the production of the EITI reports. They are increasingly involved in dissemination of the findings and analyzing the significance of the data that we generate. That in turn can provide a resource for advocacy by civil society and opportunities to influence government policy and industry practices. I mentioned this increasing granularity of reporting disclosures at the EITI, which increases the range of information and its complexity. So what we're now focusing much more on is not very long retrospective reports, but actually near real-time data. And over 90% of our data is now both in open format and publicly accessible. And we're going through a process of moving towards mainstreaming data across the entire reporting chain using web portals, company websites, to get that information out and make it more timely. One part of that EITI principle I mentioned earlier, Thomas, is about informing choice and realistic options for sustainable development. So taking our cue from that is using that data to engage with and inform choices before policymakers, particularly around resource use, the energy transition, informing really quite difficult decisions about moving from fossil fuel dependent economies and sources of revenue to cleaner ones with very different revenue bases. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like in practice, we recently commissioned a study looking at future revenue projections in the context of the energy transition in the Republic of Congo. The big anxiety on the part of fossil fuel dependent countries is what on earth are they going to use to fund critical health, education, infrastructure needs in the future once this source of revenue significantly declines. And that's an important big constituency, especially in Africa, which often the debates at the COP don't really fully engage with because that's seen as old energy. But this old energy continues to support development priorities in the context of the transition. So this is right at the heart of what we're doing. Maybe to give you another couple of quick examples, the UK has been at the forefront of some of this work. UK is both supporting our work and is an implementing country of the EITI and reports like other countries. And in the UK, it's increasingly the EITI is moving to online systematic disclosure of data through its excellent website, particularly around exploration and licensing. And that's, of course, very pertinent now with one of the effects of the crisis in the energy sector as an offshoot of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So you're now seeing the new North Sea Transition Authority working to transform the collection, storage, analysis and publication of data across the oil and gas life cycle. That's a really important resource base. A different example is Argentina, which joined the EITI 2 years ago, and they've created an open information system on mining activity in Argentina. Colombia has produced a guide to environmental payments in the extractive sector, identifying 14 different fiscal instruments, ranging from all of those applicable to all companies to fees and taxes specific to the extractive sector. And these include payments for water and forest use, insurance, mine closures, licenses and fines. The last point here, Thomas, I want to make is about subnational implementation. A number of countries in the EITI have actually created subnational EITI units. The best example is Peru. Others are also doing so. And this is really quite significant because many subnational governments in extractive dependent economies give a share of their revenues to local authorities. So it's really important to empower people at the local level to get a handle on what's been transferred to the local authority, how are those decisions made, and how is that resource in turn reinvested back into communities. So really trying to address access to information around local revenue flows and then spending priorities, many of which are associated with a post-fossil fuel future. Which brings me to my last example around work we're currently engaged in looking at how local communities face significant implications with the energy transition. This really speaks to the just transition. So the Ford Foundation has been supporting our work in Ghana, Colombia, and Indonesia to examine how access to information can critically inform the implications for local communities, implications for revenues, for services and jobs. So that's another example of how we're thinking about how to get the information out and down through local communities.
Mark, thank you. Those sounds like some very interesting and promising national and subnational and community focused initiatives. Can you also say a few words about what EITI does in regards to company reporting and accountability maybe at the corporate level?
Yeah, and I mentioned that companies are an important part of our tripartite structure. And interestingly, that constituency is primarily oil and gas and minerals at the moment, but many of our companies are diversified away from fossil fuel exclusive extraction to a much more diversified energy portfolio. So the companies themselves are greening, which further supports that transition that we're making organizationally, putting the energy transition more at the heart of our work, whilst very much keeping the focus on anti-corruption. We have a set, so all companies in any EITI country have to report under the EITI standard. And interestingly, that is not just our 65 supporting companies, but actually all companies that over a certain threshold of production, including companies from China or Russia or other non-EITI members. So it provides a really good lens to throw light on a whole range of investments by a whole range of companies, not just the 65 supporting ones. For those 65 supporting companies, and the reason we call them supporting is that they buy into our principles and provide some element of financial support for our work. We've just concluded an extended process of revising what we call expectations for EITI companies, which has really raised the bar on the way in which companies are expected to behave, to report in line with the EITI standard. So you've got some really quite phenomenal commitments now around quite weighty disclosure requirements. For example, all companies are expected to declare their the contracts they enter into with governments and put them in the public domain. Some are going a step further and disclose in all contracts. Very powerful anti-corruption instrument. On beneficial ownership, as TI was saying, and OGP2, really going up our priority list with significant commitments by companies around beneficial ownership transparency. And back in September, we launched and had 6 key global companies really as champions of beneficial ownership disclosure, signing up to that. So these commitments can be used to help companies demonstrate progress, but also to be held to account. That information for the very first time was published in an assessment we did at the end of last year in the public domain. The next assessment round with these revised expectations will be conducted in the early part of 2023 and launched just ahead of our 20th anniversary global conference in Africa. So I firmly believe that having such a set of public expectations is quite unique in terms of having 65 leading edge companies indicating those commitments to the EITI globally.
Mark, thank you. Aled, if I can turn to you, what are the recent trends and challenges that you've seen in access to environmental information related specifically to corruption?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thanks very much for the opportunity to join the panel. So my remarks will draw mainly on 2 projects I've been involved with in recent years, the 5-year Targeting Natural Resource Corruption project, or TNRC, funded by USAID, where we've been doing research with local partners in Peru, Madagascar and Vietnam, and a project for the German Embassy in Indonesia, which involved collaboration with the Indonesian Corruption Eradication Commission, the KPK. So I think what we see is that in terms of recent trends, although there is increased interest in environmental corruption and in information on environmental corruption, anti-corruption efforts directly related to the environment are in practice still few and far between. So much so actually that we've struggled to identify aid-funded interventions that directly attempt to tackle environmental corruption. There are many projects that focus on related challenges, for example, illegal logging or other environmental crimes. But there is a sense that anti-corruption is often an afterthought in project theories of change. On the positive side, this holds a promise because it means that more can be done potentially on environmental corruption with a much more direct and concerted effort. I think overall, we should recognize that any anti-corruption efforts that do exist in this space are generally taking place within neoliberal approaches to environmental protection and a worrying global rise in authoritarianism. And it remains to be seen how well these environmental neoliberal approaches, such as REDD+, the Anti-Deforestation Initiative, can really deal with rising authoritarianism, including in the environmental sphere. And I'm sure we've all heard of this environmental authoritarianism concept, which is widely discussed in the scholarly literature. Now, for the TNSE project, we did around 300 interviews among conservation beneficiaries and other stakeholders in Peru, Madagascar, and Vietnam. And what that showed us was that there's a lot of information available and knowledge on how corruption in various forms has seriously detrimental impacts on the environment, for example, leading to deforestation, but also on society, for example, leading to serious rights abuses. So corruption is closely bound up with this perpetration of various environmental crimes, insecure land or resource tenure, impunity of office holders, particularly when the resources in question hold strategic or export significance. And as mentioned earlier, with the concern around environmental defenders in Latin America, in Peru in particular, we saw an urgent need to tackle appalling violence against environmental defenders, including indigenous peoples who are speaking out against corruption. Now, the recent investigations that we've looked at and corruption indictments do allege close connections between, for example, illegal timber barons and regional office holders in Peru. And that is, to us, indicative of collusive corruption connected to resource rent extraction. There is information around how corruption affects environmental outcomes and how it perverts democracy. But unfortunately, these are often not connected to official data on criminal cases. So we found in Madagascar, for example, that criminal cases often don't go anywhere in the judicial system. And that creates a sense of disappointment and disillusion among many conservationists in Madagascar. But we have come across some positive examples of information being used to prosecute environmental corruption too. We've worked recently with the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission, the KPK, to analyze the very many forest corruption cases that they've successfully prosecuted over the past decade. And what we did was we conducted a social network analysis to reveal other members of those corrupt networks who could be investigated in future by the Indonesian authorities. Unfortunately, the omnibus package of laws, which was introduced in Indonesia in 2020, curtailed the powers of the KPK in quite a radical way. And there are fears among the country's anti-corruption activists that this was done because the KPK had simply become too effective in prosecuting corruption. But the KPK does continue its work, and there is more work going on in the environmental corruption sphere.
Thank you very much. You've outlined a few of the recent developments, but can you think of some positive ones that have taken place?
We do see that there are various access to information initiatives that are ongoing in the natural resources space. For example, in Indonesia, the One Map, One Data policy is one that we've been following quite closely over the last few years. And in theory, that should provide a lot of information in the public domain, essentially bringing together a range of different cadastral maps from Indonesia in different land use areas, bringing that all together in one digital map, and that being accessible to various stakeholders, including members of the public, academics, private sector, and so on. Unfortunately, we do see that some of the promises earlier made on making that data publicly available have not been followed through as quickly as we would have liked. That this may partly be due to needed, barriers to commercial sensitivity, needing to check this information for rigor and validity before it can be put out in the public domain. However, there are other reasons as well. There have been some legislative attempts to undermine the credibility of the KPK and their ability to do anti-corruption investigations. So there can also be some perhaps not so good reasons why this information is not being put out there as early as it was promised to do so. This is just one type of initiative that we see many different types of initiatives that can make a big difference. And also the development of new technologies, for example, using digital tools to develop cadastral maps in Peru, for example. It has been done by private companies, but it has not yet been done by the public authorities in Peru. So there are a lot of areas where further work can be done to draw out environmental data and information that can be used for anti-corruption purposes.
Thank you. And when you think about all of the initiatives that certainly you've done research on, what are some of the common ongoing challenges that you think they face?
So I think one of the challenges particularly for democratic institutions and the law enforcement bodies that are connected to democratic states is that, of course, parliamentarians and office holders are often deeply involved in the political economy of resource extraction themselves. There's an excellent book called The Rule Makers from the Philippine Center of Investigative Journalism, which discusses the elite interests in the Philippines parliament. And parliaments themselves are, of course, sites of elite contestations over resource use and control. And when these contestations are resolved following the rule of law and principles of democratic accountability, established political convention, then of course all can be quite well. But there are many points at which political gatekeepers can become involved in corruption within democratic systems, thereby perverting them, as we all know. So I think one area in particular that we would point to is election finance. A corruption case, for example, prosecuted by the KPK in recent years saw the former head of Indonesia's constitutional court accept a cash bribe from a businessman precisely because of the former's role as an arbiter in election disputes. So the outcomes of elections in Indonesia tend to be decisive for natural resource investments. And so the constitutional court became a corruption target. And there's a lot of information on this case from the investigative journalism project, the Gecko project, which I would highly recommend. So I think that election finance in particular is a very interesting place to start and to look further into for organizations which are involved in democracy promotion.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to turn to our attendees, and we've already received a few questions, so many thanks for those. If you have other questions, do please drop them into the Q&A. I'm going to ask panelists in advance to answer questions, but of course, if any one of the panelists would like to jump in on a particular question, please do so. And Mark, I'd like to put the first question to you. So, and I'm not sure everyone has access to these questions, so let me read them out. The first question is, how do we ensure that access to information is applied to good environmental actions as well? Many local communities are left out completely in state-sanctioned and private sector-led renewable energy projects. Green must be fair too. So Mark, can I put that one to you?
Absolutely. We are in the early stages of conversations with renewable energy companies who are coming to us and saying, look, as we scale our investments in wind and solar in challenging governance environments, we face increased corruption risk, which of course is not surprising, because many of those investments really were at scale more in stable governance environments, but increasingly opportunities have been sought elsewhere. Now, it's absolutely true that few of those companies have had to grapple with long-standing issues around governance, stability, transparency, limitations on corruption risk that the oil, gas, and mining companies have done. So there's a huge opportunity for lesson learning. So there's sometimes a bit of an assumption that green means clean. That's not necessarily the case. Green can also face significant challenges. So one way that we're contributing is simply to promote lesson learning from 20 years of experience of the EITI in very difficult sectors to some of these newer areas of energy investment. So the question's spot on. The other part of the question around local community engagement, I touched on briefly from our vantage point, but one of the fundamental questions around some of the new technologies, of course, is land acquisition for both solar and wind. I mean, that's very much an issue for mines, particularly open mines. So again, some lesson learning around the politics and corruption risk in land acquisition is quite a fundamental one. So they're not the same industries, they're different. The other thing that they share in common, of course, is around critical minerals, mainly in terms of sourcing for both of those subsectors. And that's an area which is booming at the moment and is a massive source of future corruption risk, particularly as unscrupulous actors come in to the scene trying to make fast, big money, deliberately will not or minimize the possibility of talking to local communities, and neither create the jobs locally or pay the taxes they should be locally. So, and frankly, I was really quite astounded in my short experience at the COP, where the focus was on the rush to green finance and green investment, all well and good. Virtually no mention whatsoever of this set of issues by any of the participants present. So frankly, one lesson of this event ought to be thinking hard about how to use some of these very important fora, and the COP is a key one here to make sure these factors receive attention and are properly debated. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. If I can turn to our next question, and Bryce, I'm going to throw this one at you if that's okay. So the question is, how one should act if national parliaments adopt legislation on environmental assessment instruments depriving concerned public of the consultation opportunities when introducing legislative changes largely contested by civil society organizations. Is that parliamentary democracy at play, or a lack of transparency by elected officials?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think we just need to also change a bit the way some of the decisions are made. I think it sounds like that specific example shows how, you know, one way of seeing things are only experts need to decide, no? And I think what we more and more understand and recognize is that there is also a truth and a value in hearing the public, civil society organization, communities on the ground, whereas, you know, it's a positive green investment, or an investment that can be even more problematic for the environment. So we've seen, I think, in a few countries some trials of you know, giving a bit of that decision-making power to civil society or even the public through, for example, what was called a climate parliament. But then it has been also widely criticized in the end about how the initial intention of those initiatives have been followed or not followed, and in the end, national politicians or parliamentarians kind of retaking that decision-making power. So I think that's, for me, that's not how the way you know, we should do policy making at the moment, and I think we need to kind of revamp the way we manage those investments, and again, including climate initiatives or green initiatives, and so that there is no space for corruption and for initiatives that don't work for the environment, but for people as well in the end. So in that specific case, I mean, it depends, you know, what were the intentions of the parliament. It can be, just as I was saying, like a kind of the way of thinking, or it could also be, and we saw that even in Europe, for example, for renewables, where, you know, some politicians saw the opportunities coming and try to capture those investments. So that can also be that case.
Yes, thank you, Bryce. So our next question, and Rosario, I'm going to ask you to answer this one, please, is from Stefano Zanobi. And the question is, access to information requires a degree of power concessions from governments to citizens and civil society. In many countries with limited openness, the more the civil society advocate for freedom, the more the government becomes concerned and tightens up on those freedoms. How can you break this impasse?
Thank you. This is one of our main worries. We are seeing some civic space restrictions growing in the region. You can see the Civicus Index and many other researchers. We show that even with the pandemic, many countries impose severe restrictions to access to information, which limited access for civil society. So first, we have to reassure that those restrictions are paused or canceled as the normality returns and access to information is back to the normal procedures. But beyond that, of course, as I think Stefan was saying, opening spaces for dialogue and for access to information in place changes in culture and in habits and in practices, both for governments and for private sector. I think it's really important that we as an international community work together, both to protect activists and civic space on the field, but also to strengthen these platforms where all the voices can gather together and debate, deliberate around these issues and propose concrete steps forward. The protagonists and the main actors are the civil society on the field. We as international players can help them, can support them, can raise our voices in the international context, but the main issue is to protect the actors on the countries.
Rosario, thank you. Bryce, I'm going to bring you back in again on the next question because it relates to your comments, and it's from Scott Hadjoist. And he writes, protecting and rewarding whistleblowers is increasingly recognized as an important tool in promoting good governance and the rule of law and in combating corruption and environmental crime. Could one of the panelists address what they think is important to enhancing the role of whistleblowers?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, yeah, the issue of whistleblowers is obviously linked to the issues we've been discussing now about civic space, but we also recognize the very high value of whistleblowers and what they can do to bring those cases, especially in countries where maybe the access to information is not good. That being said, of course, those people are at risk, as environmental defenders are and anti-corruption activists as well, and often they are bringing similar issues, or you have the different aspects in the same cases. So I think it's not that easy. I mean, our experience in trying to push for some kind of whistleblowers protection is not easy, especially in countries where the judiciary system doesn't work very well, no? Because you can have laws in place or policies, but that could even be more putting those people more at risk. So I think some of the good features of whistleblower protection is, I mean, first having it existing. So as I said, in many countries or in many organizations, there are no whistleblower protection laws or policies. And of course, even when they are there, often they are not being very well implemented. And we worked in some cases even involving whistleblowers from UNDP, for example, on some environmental projects where the whistleblower seemed to have been retaliated. But some of the good criteria would be confidentiality for the reasons I think I just mentioned, having access to independent reporting channels, and I think one maybe other aspect that is quite important is the scope, who can be actually considered as a whistleblower.
Bryce, thank you. And our last question, and Alit, if I may, I'm going to turn to you on this one, is from Esther Filippini. And Esther writes, it is music to my ears to hear about how transparency can address corruption, how the participation of vulnerable communities can improve social justice and climate actions, and how public revenues can contribute to development and accountability. Ideally, indeed, advancing stable democracies and tackling climate change should make progress together. But we know that this has become increasingly challenging. Could any of the speakers share experience in building collaboration with the climate field, NGO and donors, to identify joint actionable good governance goals?
Thank you. It's a very good question. I would say that our research has deliberately engaged with the perspectives of vulnerable groups in subnational provinces of Peru to try to understand their perspectives on corruption and how that affects environmental outcomes where they live. What we see from that work is that the extent to which vulnerable groups and indigenous peoples and others are actually involved and a part of the formal democratic structures at subnational level is very limited. So clearly there is a need to work on further on inclusion, on participation of all societal groups in a particular location in the democratic institutions that exist in that location. I think there is maybe some caution that is needed in terms of what climate projects and climate institutions can do in terms of democratic promotion and inclusion. There are some, the reasons why inclusion don't occur. I'm not entirely sure whether or not neoliberal environmental projects or approaches will be able to solve those fundamental questions around, for example, unequal and contested land tenure, unequal involvement in democratic institutions, contested resource sovereignty in particular places. My research has focused on, in particular, on FPIC, how that has been done in Sulawesi in Indonesia. And unfortunately, FPIC is meant to be a tool for increasing participation and making sure that there is informed consent for climate projects, in this case, REDD+. But often what we see is that this type of tools can be very easily subverted by the existing power dynamics in a particular location. So if there is an equal access to decision makers and power in a particular area, then FPIC can be conducted in a way that simply replicates those power inequalities and injustices. So I think we have to be somewhat cautious in terms of the tools and measures that climate financing organizations or climate organizations can implement. Although, so in a sense that speaks to the role that is needed from democracy promoting organizations and democratic inclusion organizations.
Ale, thank you. Mark, please.
If I might just add to Alet's points from a slightly different vantage point, I think there are opportunities to think about how to maximize the potential synergy between democratic spaces and progressing on the climate agenda. This is much more the realm of climate governance, but a really great research project that started when I was still at WRI a few years ago really was looking at what are the political and institutional conditions in countries that would facilitate more convincing, deeper commitment to climate goals, particularly the SDG on climate and the broader Paris Agreement. Recognizing actually that many of these, the absence of many such factors impede progress. There's sometimes a view that policy making is a neutral space. But of course, unless you have effective mobilization, the right legal environment, and the right policy instruments with a capable bureaucracy, if those features are absent, it makes significant progress on climate goals really difficult. But maybe that's the subject for the next conference. I just thought I would flag those opportunities.
Mark, thank you. And you may have partially answered my last question to you all. So before we close, I would like to put one question to each of the panelists, the same question. And it links back actually, I think partly, Mark, to a point you made earlier as to the uniqueness of this particular conference and hopefully the beginning of a conversation to come, but also Devon's opening comments about the role of democracy assistance actors. So the same question to all of you, and again, to be taken in the same order as we've gone through the questions with you today. But if you think about the role of those democracy assistance actors and the synergies between the work of WFD and similar organizations to your institutions and your areas of expertise, what would you be encouraging WFD to focus on? Where should their energies be placed? What could make the most sense? Rosario, if I can start with you again, please.
Sure. Well, I think I'm repeating myself, but I would say supporting national civil society actors. I think it's key. They are the ones who understand the context, who will be dealing with the impacts and the reforms of the government's public policies. So I think that all we can do as international actors to support their work and to support the local communities is very important and strategic.
Rosario, thank you. Bryce.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as I was saying, I think there are some aspects for, I mean, that would be beneficial for different sectors, but I think especially for climate and environmental issues, trying to revamp or reinvent the way you know, some of those investments or some of the decision making is made would be important, and that can be through this fora, trying to bring those communities together. And as the previous question was pointing out, and as several of us said, indeed there are big silos now, especially between the governance community on one side, governance and democracy, and environment, climate community on the other side, and those bridges are not easy. And I think, for example, the example that Aled, you were talking about the KPK, the Indonesian anti-corruption agency, that's, to my knowledge, you know, one of the few anti-corruption agency that is looking at environmental issues. So some of those bodies don't really see as in their scope to look at those issues, and some of the governance or democracy institutions don't really see again in their realm to look at environmental and climate issues, and this need to change. And that's why I'm talking about this. Yeah, how could we revamp the way we are doing things, and especially when it comes to environment and climate, and how we can make sure there is no space for corruption.
All right, thank you. Mark.
Thank you. Parliaments and political parties. Some years ago in DC, I was involved in an extended conversation with NDI about what could be the entry points for them with their democracy assistance work. And I'm very convinced that this is a golden opportunity for WFD and other similarly minded democracy assistance organizations. As Devon said at the outset, those are the key strengths very often of democracy assistance organizations. Almost totally absent has been the agenda we've been discussing today. There's very little systematic effort to sensitize, to promote greater awareness, both of policy issues, potential ways in which progress can be made on a whole range of issues we've discussed today, with major political parties, and indeed parliamentarians or parliamentary committees. There's a kind of, we talked about the silo between democracy organizations and environmental ones. The other silo is actually around the agendas. It's the emphasis in the past has not always been one of thematic entry points. And I know that's a big area for discussion, but for this agenda to cohere, frankly, think hard about the opportunities of deepening parliamentary engagement and awareness. Parliamentarians get really frustrated by the fact they're often left out by conversations that are dominated by civil society and officials. They're the ones, ultimately, they're going to push this agenda in their own domestic and subnational environments. So absolutely, this is the area where I would think it's a golden opportunity for democracy assistance as organizations to collaborate further.
Thank you, Mark. Aled.
I think the efforts should focus really on selling the case for countries and states who may be considering to engage more in an environmental authoritarian approach for managing the biodiversity and climate crisis, in terms of the benefits of democracy for environmental outcomes. So we know that democracies are generally better at dealing with environmental problems than non-democracies. But there is still a contested debate going on around in the public space around which modes of governance are the best for dealing with acute climate and biodiversity issues. So I think that building the case and showing how these outcomes relate to improved democratic institutions, improved democratic accountability, is a very important role. And certainly I think it's a very productive space to have further discussion between environmental focused organizations and democracy promoting organizations. It's very much needed.
Ale, thank you. With that, on what I hope is a somewhat optimistic note, despite the huge challenges that are still faced, but optimistic note of finding new synergies and opportunities to work together across sectors in order to promote access to information, but the challenges around environmental democracy. I want to close by thanking Rosario, Bryce, Mark, and Aled, as well as all the colleagues at WFD for pulling this panel together. So with that, I think that brings us to an end. So again, my thanks to everyone.